Yeah, breaking news here on First Take. According to Shams, LeBron James is signing with the Philadelphia 76ers on a 2-year, $8 million deal with a player option.
LeBron James is going to the city of brotherly love. LeBron James has agreed to join the Philadelphia 76ers.
Is it 2019 all over again? See, every few years, the NBA has an offseason that completely changes the direction of the league. You could go all the way back to 2010 when we had the formation of the Big Three in Miami, or even 2016 when we had KD joining the Warriors, or 2019, which was probably one of the craziest offseasons, where we had AD going to the Lakers, Kawhi and PG ending up in LA as members of the Clippers, Russell Westbrook to the Rockets, and of course Kyrie and KD ending up in Brooklyn. But then that brings us to this year, and man, there's been some crazy movement, where of course we had LeBron James joining the Philadelphia 76ers, which honestly still seems crazy to say, and we also had Giannis ended up in Miami, LaMelo Ball ended up in Minnesota, Ja Morant in Portland, Jaylen Brown in Philly, and Kawhi is back in the place where he last won a championship in Toronto. Or at least we think. And at a first glance, it just seems like one of those wild free agency periods that we've seen before. But I think something much bigger is happening. Because this offseason didn't just shuffle stars from one team to another. It exposed a fundamental shift in how NBA teams are built, how stars are being valued, and where the balance of power in the league is officially heading. Because for years, people have wondered if the NBA had reached the end of the super team era. Others question whether the league's new collective bargaining agreement would stop stars from teaming up. And many believe that the Western Conference would continue to dominate the NBA landscape. But after everything we've seen this summer, I think every one of those assumptions has been challenged. Because this offseason revealed 4 major changes that could define the next decade of basketball. So today, we're going to discuss all of those changes and how the NBA offseason may have changed the future of the league forever. But before we continue, I just want to give a huge shout out to everyone that showed love to the channel and helped it grow. And if you're not subscribed yet, join in on the fun. Hit the like button, subscribe, and also hype this video up. Now without further ado, let's get back to the video. So let's start with what everyone noticed first, the player movement. If you followed the NBA long enough, blockbuster moves have always been a part of the league. Every offseason, there's usually one headline that dominates the conversation. Maybe a superstar requests a trade, or maybe a marquee free agent changes teams, and the rest of the league just adjusted around it. But this offseason felt completely different, because so many key names are ending up in different uniforms. Uniforms that for the most part we haven't seen them wear before. We have LeBron in Philly, Giannis taking his talents down to South Beach, LaMelo Ball is headed to Minnesota, Ja Morant is looking at redemption in Portland, Jaylen Brown, who was just literally in MVP talks in Boston, is now in Philly as well. And in one of the most poetic moves of the summer, Kawhi Leonard is returning to the city where he cemented his legacy, as it appears, for now, that he's headed back to Toronto. And on paper, these just look like transactions, right? But actually, I don't think that's the story. Because unlike previous eras that were defined by player empowerment, this offseason felt like it was defined by organizational aggression. I mean, think about it. How many of these moves happened because the player publicly demanded out? Not many. You could only really point to the Giannis trade, if anything. Instead, what we've seen this summer is that front offices have made the decision that standing still was more dangerous than making a blockbuster trade. That's a huge philosophical shift. For decades, the safest move for an NBA franchise was probably to hold on to your stars as long as possible. Even if a team wasn't quite ready to compete for a championship, organizations were reluctant to move franchise stars because those type of players are incredibly difficult to replace. But in today's league, waiting might actually be a bigger risk. General managers have honestly watched too many situations play out the same way. A superstar enters the final years of his contract, the team hesitates, negotiations drag on, the player's future becomes uncertain, Suddenly, leverage is gone. Maybe the player walks in free agency, maybe they request a trade with only one preferred destination, or maybe injuries or age start to chip away at their value. Either way, the return isn't what it could have been. So instead of waiting for that moment, teams are being more proactive. We're entering an NBA where front offices would rather trade a star 1 year too early than 1 year too late. Because in today's league, flexibility has become almost as valuable as the talent itself. Draft picks matter more, young players on rookie contracts matter more, cap flexibility matters more, and perhaps most importantly, control matters more. Organizations would rather dictate the timing of a blockbuster than have circumstances dictate it for them. And based on these offseason moves, we can see exactly why front offices are thinking this way. Take for example a Jaylen Brown trade, where the Celtics knew that they wanted to capitalize on when his value was at its highest, and also to move off of his expensive contract. And although the return for him might have not been the best, it's understandable why they needed to trade him. Then you look at a situation like Ja Morant, where the circumstances dictated the move. Ja Morant, with his self-inflicted wounds, his injuries, and also his decline in play and athleticism, tanked his value quicker than we could have ever imagined. And what did that lead to? A trade where the Grizzlies got back no draft assets. A player that was viewed as a rising star not too long ago, now essentially had zero value. And then you look at the other side of things, like the LaMelo Ball trade, where even though the Charlotte Hornets had an exciting season last year, they still felt comfortable moving off of a young star due to his injury history, as well as the fact that the Hornets hadn't made the playoffs in that time. And of course, you have Minnesota trying to capitalize on their young star in Anthony Edwards by securing another backcourt star that matches the timeline and also helps take away the playmaking abilities from Ant-Man. And even with Kawhi, an aging superstar who's often injured, but the Clippers went ahead and tried to take advantage of his best season in quite a while and ended up trading him back to Toronto. And in return, the Clippers get back something that they desperately needed, and that's draft assets. See, that's why this offseason felt so different, because these weren't desperate moves. They were calculated ones. You compare that to an offseason like 2019, which is known as one of the craziest offseasons in recent memory. And compared to this year, that offseason had more of that player empowerment. You had someone like AD essentially forcing his way to LA. You had Kawhi signing with the Clippers and forcing the Clippers' hand to trade for Paul George. You also had Russell Westbrook essentially being able to dictate his way to the Rockets. And of course, Kyrie and KD chose their own path by teaming up in Brooklyn. That was different. This offseason though, every organization looked at its roster, looked at the new financial landscape, and asked the same question. Can this core realistically win a championship? And if the answer was no, hesitation disappeared. Now, I don't think this is totally new or anything, but honestly, I don't believe we've seen so many organizations reach that conclusion in a single offseason. In my opinion, that level of aggression completely reshaped the league almost overnight. But what's fascinating is where all that talent ended up. Because once all the dust settled, something became impossible to ignore. Almost all of these moves shifted one side of the league far more than the other. For years, the Western Conference was considered basketball's gauntlet. But after everything that happened this offseason, that balance of power may have officially shifted to the East. Because this upcoming season, the East might just be a bloodbath. Now, in case you've forgotten, just 1 year ago, the East was considered weak, probably the weakest it's been in quite a while. And that was due to the amount of injuries that stars suffered during the 2025 playoffs. We had Jason Tatum out with the Achilles, Tyrese Halliburton also out with the Achilles, and outside of the Cavs and the Knicks, nobody else really looked like a threat. And although the Eastern Conference ended up being a lot more competitive than we had predicted, especially with the emergence of the Detroit Pistons, the Celtics being a lot better than people expected, and of course other teams like the Toronto Raptors and the Atlanta Hawks, the East still was considered weaker than the West. Because although the bottom of the East had better records than the bottom of the West, the battle and talent of the top of the Western Conference was just considered a lot more competitive. And that's honestly the way it's been for years. Because for years, the NBA lived under one universal truth. If you wanted to survive the regular season, you wanted no part of the Western Conference. The West was always viewed as a bloodbath. It didn't matter if it was Kobe's Lakers, Duncan's Spurs, Dirk's Mavs, Durant and Russ on the Thunder, the Lob City Clippers, or Steph's Warriors. The road to the NBA Finals almost always felt harder in the West. Meanwhile, in the East, teams spent years fighting off the reputation of being in the weaker conference. It's the reason why LeBron dominated for nearly a decade, went to 8 straight NBA Finals, and was still criticized for it, because no matter how impressive that was, everyone minimized this accomplishment because it was done in the weak East. But now, I just don't think this is true anymore. Let's take a look at the Sixers. They didn't just improve, they added LeBron, who even at his age, is still one of the better players in the league. They also added someone in Jaylen Brown, who's a great fit on this roster with his scoring ability and his point of attack defense. And all it took was getting off of Paul George's contract and a few draft picks. They also had an underrated pickup in Dean Wade, who provide even more defense and also some spacing on the floor. And of course, they kept their franchise core pieces in Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey. Now, of course, their success is predicated on health. But in my opinion, if healthy, this team has the potential to be scary because they have the ball handling and playmaking in LeBron James, who's reportedly going to play point guard. They have the point of attack defense. They have the spacing. They have the interior presence with Embiid, and their bench isn't too bad either. In just one offseason, the Sixers transformed from a team with a bleak future into one of the top contenders in their conference. And then of course you have Miami, who landed a top 5 player in the entire NBA, and they should be monsters on defense, even though they need to round out their roster with some more shooting and some more depth. But even with those deficiencies, Miami should still be one of the top threats in the East this upcoming season. And then you have another team in the Toronto Raptors who are potentially adding Kawhi Leonard and should be a lot more competitive this season. You have another team in the Atlanta Hawks who continue to improve. The Cleveland Cavaliers were just in the Eastern Conference Finals. Tyrese Halliburton is returning to the Indiana Pacers. Even though the Detroit Pistons have some things to figure out, I still see them as one of the top threats as well. And even after the Jaylen Brown trade, I still think the Celtics will be one of the most competitive teams in the East this season, and I still have them finishing as a top 4 seed in the conference. And last but certainly not least, the defending champions, the New York Knicks, practically brought back their entire roster as they look to be the first team in this decade to repeat as champions. Based on all of this info alone, we could be looking at an Eastern Conference that has top tier competition from seeds 1 through 8, potentially 1 through 9. In other words, this conference is absolutely stacked. What's fascinating though about this is that it isn't one dominant super team towering over everybody else. It's a conference filled with teams that all believe that they can make the NBA Finals. And that changes everything. Because for years, many superstars looked at the Western Conference and knew there was simply too many obstacles. Now, that conversation is shifting in the opposite direction. If you're a team in the East, your path isn't getting any easier. It's going to be absolute war just to make the playoffs. Hell, maybe even the play-in, because now the Eastern Conference has become the center of the NBA universe. The biggest stars, the biggest expectations, and arguably the biggest championship threats are all concentrated on one side of the bracket. But you want to know something very interesting? I don't think this happened by accident. These front offices aren't suddenly becoming more aggressive because they feel like it. They're responding to something much bigger. The NBA's new financial landscape has forced teams to rethink everything. For years, the blueprint was simple. Draft a superstar, pay your second star whatever it takes, and figure the rest out later. Today, that's no longer an option. The new collective bargaining agreement has fundamentally changed how teams build contenders, and this offseason might have been the first time we truly saw its full impact. And that impact has helped reshape the entire league. When the league introduced the second apron, the goal was pretty simple. Prevent teams from stockpiling expensive stars forever, force organizations to think twice before handing out massive contracts, and create more parity across the league. At least that was the idea. But after watching this offseason unfold, I think the second apron may have done something totally different. Because it didn't just eliminate superstar teams, it eliminated the traditional second option. Allow me to explain. So before, we had a familiar formula when it came to building a contender. You drafted or acquired a franchise superstar, and then you found the perfect second star. You paid both of them maximum money, you filled out the roster with quality veterans and role players, and you hoped that your championship window stayed open long enough to win. And of course, this wasn't really perfect, but it was predictable. Teams were comfortable playing 2 elite players because that was simply the cost of competing for championships. But under the second apron, that calculation has changed dramatically. The penalties aren't just financial anymore because teams now lose flexibility. They lose the ability to improve around the margins, making trades becomes significantly more difficult, and adding depth becomes way more difficult as well. Even keeping your own roster together becomes a challenge. We literally saw the effect that it had on the Boston Celtics right after they won a championship. They practically had to tear that roster apart due to financial restrictions. And yes, contrary to what some people may have said in my Celtics video, I do understand why the Celtics needed to trade Jaylen Brown in the first place. I just didn't like the return they got. Also, go check out that video if you get a chance. But yeah, front offices are starting to ask a question that probably would have sounded ridiculous just a few years ago. Is this player actually worth a max contract? If paying him prevents us from building a championship roster? Let's look at some examples. Of course, we've already mentioned Jaylen Brown, an NBA champion, a finals MVP, someone who was in MVP discussions just last season, ends up being traded due to his large contract. And although this move didn't happen during the offseason, Trae Young was traded to the Wizards, and it seemed like that was due to the same issues as well. And then you look at someone like Jalen Duren, who underperformed in the playoffs, and now the Pistons, as well as other teams around the league, are having their doubts when it comes to paying him his max extension. We could even look at the perception around the league about Austin Reeves' contract that he just signed, where most people are looking at this like an absolute overpay. And then you look at some other second options that could potentially be on the move as well, such as a Jamal Murray, Alfred Sengun, and Jimmy Butler. And all of this leads to one conclusion. If you're a star on an NBA team that's a second option, and you're not one of those top 10 players in the NBA, meaning that you're a player who, on your own, isn't viewed as somebody capable of leading a team to a championship, at that point, front offices are going to have a hard time paying you max money. And it's not because teams don't value elite talent, it's just that the math doesn't work the same way it used to. Instead of paying 2 established stars enormous contracts, organizations are beginning to ask whether they're better off surrounding one true superstar with younger, cheaper talent who can grow into those roles. Think about how valuable rookie-scale contracts have become. If a player can produce close to all-star impact while making a fraction of a veteran's salary, that's an incredible competitive advantage. For these front offices, every dollar saved creates flexibility. Every young contributor allows you to build a deeper roster. Under this CBA, depth isn't just a nice to have. It might be the single most valuable asset in the league. And that's why we see a change in the behavior. General managers are becoming a lot more aggressive because they know waiting is dangerous. If your roster isn't good enough today, locking yourself into an expensive long-term contract could trap your franchise for years. That's why we're seeing teams move players they probably would have kept under the old system. Not because those players suddenly became worse, but because the financial consequences of paying everyone has become too severe. The league has entered an era where good teams are being forced to make uncomfortable decisions much earlier than they're used to. And yes, this has been around for a couple of years now, but this offseason really showed the true impact of this change. And it's going to be very interesting to see how teams are built going forward, especially with the new draft rules that are coming into effect as well. But do you want to know the irony behind all of this? The NBA designed these rules to make it harder for stars to team up. But yet somehow instead, I think this offseason may have revealed a brand new blueprint. Because while organizations are becoming way less willing to pay traditional second stars, one type of superstar suddenly makes more sense than ever: the aging superstar. A player who's already made hundreds of millions of dollars, a player whose legacy is already secure, a player who's willing to sacrifice salary for one more chance at a championship, or even perhaps their first chance at a championship. And no move illustrated that better than LeBron James joining the Philadelphia 76ers. See, this one move brings us to what I believe is the biggest takeaway from the entire offseason. The NBA didn't kill super teams, it simply changed the way a super team looks. Because for years, people believed the second apron would put an end to the era of stars joining forces. The logic made sense. If teams couldn't afford multiple max contracts, if penalties became harsher, if roster flexibility disappeared, then ultimately we'll stop seeing teams loaded with superstar talent. Instead, teams would have to build around one superstar with excellent depth, good roster construction, and proper drafting. But after this offseason, I think we might have discovered the next evolution of the super team. And ironically, it's LeBron James that may have just given the rest of the league the blueprint. Because funnily enough, the old blueprint for super teams may have been created by LeBron James. For the better part of the last 15 or so years, super teams followed the same script. And it started, of course, with LeBron joining the Miami Heat and forming the Big Three with Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh. And then, of course, we had Kevin Durant joining the 73-9 Golden State Warriors, where they already had Steph, Klay Thompson, and Draymond Green. And then, of course, we have Brooklyn, where they tried to put Kevin Durant, Kyrie, and James Harden together, which ultimately didn't work out. But regardless, the formula was simple. Take multiple superstars who are still in or near their prime, pay all of them enormous contracts, figure out the rest of the roster later, and sometimes it worked, and of course, as we've seen, sometimes it didn't. Now, eventually, that financial strain caught up to almost every one of those teams. But back then, teams didn't really care because it was worth the risk of trying to compete for a championship. However, today's NBA is quite a bit different, because the second apron punishes teams for trying to keep several players on massive long-term deals. So instead of building around 3 max contract stars, or maybe even 2 max contract stars, what if the answer is this? 1 franchise superstar, 1 or 2 younger stars who are already under contract, a deep supporting cast, and then an aging legend who's already earned generational wealth and is willing to take significantly less money because what matters most isn't another paycheck, it's another championship. And that's exactly why LeBron's move to Philadelphia feels so important. Because yes, he's still one of the greatest players to ever touch a basketball, but he's also 41 years old. Now, he's made hundreds of millions of dollars throughout his career, and at this stage, another max contract doesn't define his legacy. Winning does. Now, I do want to make one very important distinction here. The Philadelphia 76ers aren't some perfect example of how to get around the second apron. They still have 3 max level players in Joel Embiid, Tyrese Maxey, and Jaylen Brown. But the reason they were able to build this roster is because they already had the infrastructure in place. Maxey was drafted and retained using bird rights, allowing them to keep their own star while maintaining flexibility. And then on top of that, they hit another home run in the draft when they got VJ Edgecombe, giving them yet another high upside contributor on the cost-controlled rookie contract. That's exactly the type every contender covets under the new CBA. So with this LeBron signing, instead of Philly having to tear apart its roster to fit him financially, he joins a team that's already built. Joel Embiid, Tyrese Maxey, a newly acquired Jaylen Brown, a strong supporting cast. Instead of creating the foundation, LeBron becomes the finishing piece, essentially the final infinity stone. And the crazy thing about all of this is that I don't think he's going to be the last superstar to do it. I mean, think about it. Think of the stars who will eventually reach this point. We have players like Steph Curry, Kevin Durant, maybe even Jokic down the line, Giannis, or Luka. Eventually, every superstar reaches a stage in their career where championships matter more than maximizing another contract. Under the old NBA, That often meant staying where they were because moving was too complicated. But under the new NBA, taking less money may actually become the easiest path to contention. Now, we've already kind of seen this with Jalen Brunson taking less money, and look where that led them to. And we've also seen Wemby follow the same path. But those are young stars. We're talking about aging stars taking this to a whole different level. Imagine a contender with a young MVP candidate, strong role players, financial flexibility, and then an aging Hall of Famer willing to sign below market value decides that he wants to join the team. That's terrifying. Not because it's unfair, but because it's sustainable. And that's what's ironic. The second apron was created to prevent organizations from overwhelming the league with talent. But instead, it might have accidentally created something even crazier. One that's harder to predict, harder to prevent, and in some ways might even be smarter. Now, in terms of who could be next to follow down this same path, I'm looking at two stars in particular. One in Kevin Durant, who's been looking to get out of the Golden State shadow for years now. He's joined team after team after team, and it just hasn't worked out for him yet. Now, in his case, he has one more year with the Rockets, and then a player option in the 27-28 season, which of course means that he could probably opt in, as he would not make this kind of money anywhere else in the league. But what if at that point the Rockets aren't really doing anything, he chooses to opt out, and perhaps take a smaller deal with a contender? And then you have someone like Steph Curry, where it's been viewed that the Warriors have wasted the last years of his career, and he's going into his final year of his contract with Golden State. And it's also been said that Golden State is looking into the future, which signals that Steph Curry might not be a priority anymore in Golden State. Now, there's a chance that they might extend him, but based on the reports, I just don't see that happening. So unless the Warriors somehow shockingly trade Steph Curry, there's a chance that Steph might become a free agent, and if that's the case, he might be able to pull off the same exact thing, where he joins a contender on a smaller deal and follows the blueprint of the new super team. Now, of course, all of this might not be true. Not every aging superstar wants to forego that money like LeBron did, and we also have to consider the risk, as there's a chance this might not even work out for those aging superstars since injuries can come into question. But regardless of the way you look at it, the super team era is not dead quite yet. So when people look back at the 2026 offseason, they're probably going to remember the headlines. The big name players switching teams. You had LeBron to Philadelphia, Giannis to Miami, Jaylen Brown leaving Boston, Ja Morant in Portland, LaMelo Ball in Minnesota, and of course Kawhi returning to Toronto. Those are the moves everyone will remember. But years from now, I think we'll realize those transactions weren't the real story. They were just evidence. The real story was that the NBA was quietly entering a new era. An era where stars move more freely than ever before, where the Eastern Conference might have become basketball's new battleground, where front offices are forced to think differently because of the second apron, and where the blueprint for building a championship team has fundamentally changed. Because as we've seen, every era in NBA history has been defined by one question: how do you build a champion? For years, we thought we already knew the answer, but after everything we've seen this summer, I'm not too sure anymore. But let me know your thoughts. Do you think this offseason changed the NBA forever? Or are we just overreacting to one crazy summer? Do you think this is the first summer that we've really seen the impact of the second apron? And also, what are your thoughts on the new blueprint for super teams? Do you think that works, or do you think super teams are officially dead? And of course, if you've made it this far in this video and you enjoyed it, go ahead and give it a like and subscribe for more, as it really does help the channel grow. And if any of the videos on your screen pique your interest, go ahead and check them out, or check out my channel for even more content. And of course, thank you for hanging with me today. It's been Dre, and these have been my thoughts. Until next time.
I can't talk on more case 'cause it's sticky. Free tea and free breezy.